Before we start, let me show you two things: a toast and a death sentence. Both are in the paperwork. Neither is in the story you've been told. That story starts in June 1940. France falls, and within weeks, the Germans are in Champagne, not just as occupiers, as customers. Large orders from the armistice on, orders the record says were welcomed at first because they put the region back to work. But by October, the terms were written down. Houses could sell their own stock again on one condition: at least 1,900,000 bottles a month for the occupying armies. Every cellar in Champagne now had a claimant. That is the world the story was born into. It goes like this. Before a single German boot ever came down the cellar stairs, a cellar master walked into the chalk and started laying bricks. A wall goes up in the dark. Behind it, the good vintages. In front of it, the wine France could afford to lose. And then, the detail everyone remembers, they farm spiders onto the fresh masonry. Cobwebs age a wall. Dust does the rest. By the time the requisition officers come down the stairs, the wall has been there forever. It's a perfect story. Cunning beats force. The occupier drinks the bad wine and never knows the difference. There's just one problem. The historian who has actually read the files, the economic records, the police records, the court records, looked at the book that made that story famous and rejected it in print. A skillful reconstruction, he called it, built after the war, defended and maintained by the CIVC, the trade's own governing body. So here's what the paperwork actually says. And it isn't about walls. It's about a table in Reims and the two men who sat on either side of it. The man on the German side arrived in July 1940 with a bureau built for one purpose: sparkling wine for the Wehrmacht. His name was Otto Klebisch. The French came to call him the Van Führer. Their word, never his title. His actual rank was far less grand, a specialist posting, the Army's label for a civilian expert in uniform. And here his story does something no screenwriter would dare. Klebisch was born in France, in Cognac. His family owned a cognac house there, seized in 1914. The man sent to take French wine had had a French wine business taken from his family in the last war. He wasn't a stranger to the trade either. Before the war, he'd sold Lanson and Martel inside Germany. And his brother-in-law was Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, a man who had once sold champagne for a living himself. Remember that. It comes back at the end. The man on the French side of the table was Robert-Jean de Vogüé, the director of Moet and Chandon, appointed under Vichy's agriculture ministry as the trade's delegate, the man who would face the occupier across it. Every week, from the spring of 1941, the trade's representatives came to the office at 3, Boulevard des Oboes, in Reims, Klebisch's office, and negotiated quotas, prices, exchange rates, passes for the trucks. The historian Christophe Lucan, who has read the record of those meetings, describes debates that stayed courteous, carried by real goodwill on the French side, always concerned, in the phrase he quotes, to keep the conditions of a franche collaboration. Hold that phrase up to the numbers. Before the war, Germany bought barely 1% of the champagne that came to market. During the occupation, 57, at prices a French damages commission would later call, in its own dry words, very low. And when the prosecutors at Nuremberg read out what Germany had officially taken from France, wheat, oats, eggs, butter, preserved fish, one entry closed the list: champagne, 56%. The prosecutor attached a warning. None of these figures include what the Germans simply bought, privately or on the black market. 56% is the floor. That's not looting in the night. That's a pipeline. And the table de Vogüé sat at every week is where it ran through. The table built an institution too. In April 1941, a law signed by Marshal Pétain created the Comité Interprofessionnel du Vin de Champagne. the CIVC, the body that governs Champagne to this day. And at the assembly announcing it, in Épernay in July of that year, the record notes that Clébiche and his deputy entered the hall and joined the customary toast. Decades later, the CIVC's own Director General would insist Vichy never wanted the institution at all, that the Champenois themselves were the true authors of that law. Read it as pride or read it as confession. It works as both. Around the table, the trade did what the paperwork says it did. When France audited itself after the liberation, the report was blunt. The auditors would have liked, they wrote, to cite Champagne as a model of pure patriotism. It was not so. On the whole, the houses, and many of the growers, had shown the enemy an attitude, their words, more than benevolent. An inspector wrote that Champagne had built scandalous fortunes in 4 years. The general inquiry into the Champagne black market, the one that risked implicating the CIVC itself, was buried, and the only Champagne trafficker seriously punished was a Reims interpreter who'd moved at least 370,000 bottles to German soldiers on requisition vouchers, signed first by Clébiche, then by his bureau, and from 1941 by the CIVC. Even he was tried as a Gestapo agent, not for the bottles. So that's the table. Here's the morning it broke, the 24th of November, 1943. The Gestapo came for Vogüé, not at his home, not at Mouette. They arrested him inside Clébiche's own office at 3 Boulevard des Oboes, the same office the trade had sat in, week after week, since the spring of 1941. 5 days later, the secretary of the Cellarmen's Union called the workers of the wine houses of Reims and Épernay out on strike in protest. Under German occupation, that order went out. They tried him not at Chalon, where their tribunal usually sat, but in the notary's hall in the middle of Reims, because the Germans wanted Champagne watching. Death sentence, then a pardon, won by interventions that tell you how tangled this world really was. The ambassador of Sweden and the government of Vichy. He was deported into Germany and survived. The men sentenced beside him were not pardoned, René and Herr Leroy. On the 22nd of March, 1944, they were shot. Others were taken. Gaston Poitevin, president of the Growers' Union, and his son-in-law, Henri Martin, were deported to Buchenwald. In February 1945, the reconstituted union elected them president and honorary member in the hope that they were coming home. Neither came back. And de Vogüé himself? At his trial, he told the German court, in his own words, that his organization was not directed against the occupying power. After the war, testifying for the prosecution at Clébiche's trial, he said the Germans' conduct had been, on the whole, and despite their disagreements, correct. The historian who assembled all of this calls him the archetype of the Vichisto resistant, appointed under Vichy, deported as a resistor, both at once, not a wall, a gray zone, as the historian of record files it. The war ended where it had to. 1945 in Berchtesgaden, soldiers of the U.S. 7th Army stand in Hitler's mountain retreat and toast the end of the war with a bottle from his private cellar. The Army's own caption says wine. It names no chateau, no house. Neither will we. And Ribbentrop, the champagne salesman who became foreign minister. When it ended, he went to Hamburg to hide and knocked on the door of an old friend, a wine merchant. An American paper that June reported that the merchant turned him away and that he went instead to the boarding house where he was captured. The trade he came from closed its door on him in the end. 56%, and that was the floor. A toast in Épernay, Herr and Leroy, shot in March. One man who sat at the table paid for it and still testified the man across it had been correct. That's what the paperwork says. And the paperwork, unlike the wall, was really there. Real stories from the ground up, that's what this channel is for. Subscribe.